Good morning, everyone. We can probably restart after our coffee break. Thank you, everyone, for participating to this conference and this panel. As announced before, we restart sharply at 11:17. The first presenter will be Stephanie Arnold. She will present a paper titled European Union and China, Partner or Rivals in the Technology Sector for the Global South. And then the discussant will be Professor Stefano Costalli. We try to stick to half an hour in total, so I will ask Stephanie to keep her presentation within the margins of 12-15 minutes to allow Professor Costalli to discuss and then open the floor for possible questions and comments. So I would leave now the floor to Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for the organizers, also for this great opportunity, for Professor Costalli for discussing my paper, and of course for all the participants for attending this conference. My name is Stephanie Arnold. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Bologna. And my research paper is on the European Union and China, and I'm asking whether they're partners or rivals in the technology sector of the Global South. As scholars of international relations, we all know of the importance and relevance of the technology sector, this is because today's influence in this sphere could actually be paramount for standard setting and norms definition, and one day even impact the control over supply chains. And two of the main players in this sphere are, as I said, the European Union and China. And today I'm going to look at whether they have an impact on the Global South. Yes, so when it comes to the European Union, I would like to highlight two important foreign policies. First of all, the Digital for Development policy, which was issued in 2017 as a Commission staff working document. I'm highlighting this policy because it is actually the policy for digitalization and digital transition in developing regions. But I would also like to point out that it was not given a dedicated budget. So it relies on the European Development Fund, the Development Cooperation Instrument, and to some extent even on the official development assistance provided by member states. On the other hand, we have the European Neighborhood Policy, which was first issued in 2003 and then revised in 2011. It focuses mainly on the Eastern and Southern neighborhood. So this comprises many former Soviet republics to the east, including Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on, and also many North African countries to the south. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because it is over the past 20 years, it has become one of the most important EU foreign policies, or let's say those regions have become a very important focus for EU foreign policies. However, they do not really mention digitalization or digital transition. They rather focus on stability, security, migration, and so on. The other point I would like to make here is that there's actually a mismatch between the Digital for Development policy focus and the EU funds destination. So what do I mean by that? What I did is I looked at how often different regions were mentioned in the Digital for Development policy. And I realized that Africa was mentioned more than 50 times compared to Asia, and this comprises all sub-regions in Asia, like Central Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and so on. It was mentioned nearly 11 times. And finally, Latin America and the Caribbean combined were mentioned just 7 times. So you can see that there's a very strong focus on the African region. However, this is not the case for the funding. So if we look, for example, at where the EU development funding went, it was mainly to Asia, and then followed by the European Neighborhood Policy region, so the Eastern and Southern neighborhood, and only then we see Africa. And finally, yeah, we have some funding that went to Latin America. we do see that the official development assistance mainly went to Africa. However, here we have to consider that only 0.09% of this aid was actually marked for telecommunication sector, and most of it actually went into good governance programs, education, health, and so on. Now, from the Chinese perspective, we're all familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an international infrastructure development program launched by China in 2013. And in 2 years later, in 2015, they opened the so-called Digital Silk Road. The Digital Silk Road is there to promote telecommunication networks, including 5G, cloud computing and data centers, but it also provides surveillance technology and builds so-called smart cities and boosts artificial intelligence capabilities, not only in China, but also in many developing countries. Now, the main problem here is that we have a rough idea of how many member states the Belt and Road Initiative has in general, but we do not really know about the content of the membership, because it's like an individual membership for each country. We have about 140 members, and it is estimated that about 1/3 of those members do enjoy some sort of let's call it privileged position for the technology, for the digital sector. And the main companies that have been present in those investments were, of course, Huawei and ZTE. Now, in order to see what happened in the technology sector, I chose to look at the ICT policy adoption. The ICT policies are very relevant when it comes to digitalization and digital transition more in general, because they're there to make sure that the digital divide doesn't widen and that digitalization actually reaches every aspect of social life, including education, health, infrastructure, good governance, and so on. What I did, I took the so-called ICT Regulatory Tracker Score. This is an index compiled by the International Telecommunications Union, a UN agency. It has been compiled since 2007, and it goes from 0 to 100. And what you can see here is that on average, every macro region worldwide has significantly improved their standing in terms of the ICT Regulatory Tracker Score. It is also important to note that the International Telecommunications Union does not actually assess the implementation or performance of those policies, but rather just whether they have been adopted and the features. What I then did was I conducted a brief multivariate regression analysis with a dependent variable that I just told you. I took its mean values, its log mean values actually from 2013 to 2018 to assess the rate of change. And then I considered various explanatory variables. All of them I calculated from 2007 to 2012 to make sure that there are not that there aren't any reciprocal sort of effects between the dependent and explanatory variables. So if you follow me on the table on the right, you see, I just have to move. Yes. So you see that FDI, so foreign direct investment inflows, foreign direct investment stocks, net official development assistance received, and the BRI membership were considered as, so let's say, economic variables. Here only FDI stocks and the aid received yielded statistically significant effects, even though they're quite low. The effects are quite small. More importantly, we see that there are statistically significant differences between the macro regions. In particular, we see that the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States, which comprises basically all the former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe and also Central Asia, they fare significantly worse compared to African countries when it comes to ICT policy adoption. However, when we look at BRI member states, so countries that have relations, Belt and Road Initiative membership, and therefore relations with China, we see that countries in the former Soviet sphere fare actually much better compared to its African peers or African BRI members. And a similar scenario we observe in East Asia and the Pacific. So we have non-BRI members in the East Asian Pacific region, which fare worse compared to African countries, but they actually fare better than BRI members in Africa. Now, a few limits and caveats are in order. When we consider this analysis, first of all, I considered only ODA, so development aid receiving countries. And this actually led to a of the sizes of the different macro regions. So for example, if we consider only aid receiving countries in Europe, we're only left with, I think, 6 or 7 countries. And they're all concentrated in the Balkan region, for example, as opposed to, I don't know, like 40 countries in Africa, for example. And then also we must bear in mind that the Belt and Road Initiative was only launched in 2013. And here I considered the Belt and Road Initiative membership as a logistic variable. So it is a 0-1 scenario. Either the country has joined the initiative since 2013 or not, and therefore it is not excluded that the improvement of the ICT score actually happened before the country joined the initiative. So now a few very preliminary, key findings. So of course the analysis is subject to a lot of refinement, both theoretical and methodological. But what this analysis so far seems to suggest is that the foreign economic influence on ICT policy adoption remains limited. This we saw with the FDI inflows and stocks, but also with the development aid received. We then could argue that the European Digital for Development policy focus on a specific region does make a positive difference. And how can we say this? It's because when we look, for example, at Africa, which is the main focus region of the Digital for Development policy, they did have a better ICT adoption, policy adoption rate compared to peers, for example, in Central Asia or even Eastern Europe. So generally the Commonwealth of Independent States. Even though many of those countries fall into the European neighborhood policy. So it seems like that this focus on digitalization and this emphasis on digital transition and the embedding and mainstreaming of new technologies into many aspects of life did have an impact on the ICT policy adoption, where the focus was there, so in Africa. And then finally, we could argue that China fills the void where EU interest for digitalization is low. And this again, is arguably the case in the Commonwealth of Independent States and also in East Asia and the Pacific region. So we saw that the European Union does not have a focus for digitalization there. And that is exactly where the Belt and Road Initiative membership of a country made the biggest positive difference. Are the European Union and China partners or rivals in the technology sector of the global South? Well, I would say that as of now, they could actually be partners. We see that where the European Union is not very present, at least in the technology sector, China jumps in and actually leads to the adoption of more ICT policies, which we could argue is positive for the overall digital development. However, we should bear in mind that due to the intrinsic features of this technology and this potential for norms definition, standard settings, and the future control of supply chains, once a country sort of aligns with one technological standard, that China could actually attract many developing countries, and later it will be very difficult for those countries to deviate from those standards and approach more European, let's call them values. So yeah, as I said, these are very preliminary findings. I would very much appreciate any comments and feedback, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you for inviting me to this workshop. First of all, I have to apologize. The first words, first apologies. Unfortunately, I have to leave soon because I have 2 more meetings afterwards. So I won't be able to attend the whole panel, but I'll try to at least be somehow useful. Second phase of apologies is due to the fact that I'm not an expert of these topics, as the presenter might know or might not know, but I have to confess I'm not an expert at these topics. So the comments I will try to provide are mainly, how to say, due to the fact that I'm an older scholar, and somehow due to the fact that I have some experience as an editor of a journal. So take it as it comes. I'm not an expert of the topics, but I will try to comment on your paper, trying to provide ways to improve it. The topic is very interesting. I keep jumping from one visualization to the other. I'm not doing anything, but
me too.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So the topic is very interesting, and it's certainly relevant, as you said in your presentation. However, I think there are ways in which you can improve the current, let's say, the current state of your paper. For instance, starting from the research question, I have to confess that I have been trying to figure out what the research question was for about 10 pages before understanding what the puzzle was about. Now, the research question should feature much more prominently in your paper, starting from the introduction. So in the introduction, any reader, and especially ignorant readers such as myself, need to understand what's the puzzle about. So what's the puzzle that you want to address? And then what's the current knowledge about this question? There might be no knowledge around, and it's fine. But if there is any knowledge around, you should bring it to the attention of the reader. And I think this is another passage that at the moment you could improve. So I don't want to sound boring, probably I will, but as a baseline, let's say as a baseline position, especially for young scholars, and especially when you want to use quantitative methods, I think that the old structure of introduction, lit review, theory, methods, empirics, findings, conclusion still works. It is a bit boring, I understand, but as a baseline, as a starting point, it gives clarity, provides structure and clarity to the readers. So at the moment, I think you should move in that direction. So what's the puzzle about? What do we know? Because at the moment, you don't really tell me what we know. You tell me, you provide interesting information, interesting data about what China and what the European Union do. Okay, but you want to explain something. And what are the available explanations at the moment? Then you can criticize the explanations, fine, and say how your explanation is better than the other ones. Okay, but first, say what's around. And then another crucial aspect, what are the possible explanatory hypotheses for the puzzle, for the research question? So, speak out your theory, or at least your theoretical hypothesis, your explanatory hypothesis. And it has to, and this has to come before the empirical analysis. So why? How? What do you propose? How do you improve the current state of the art, so to say? And then I'll try to say something about your empirical analysis and your empirical strategy. Okay. Sorry, I'm skimming your paper because, yeah, for instance, even page 6, page 7, you provide interesting information, but you have to clarify the purpose. No, how does this information fits within your story? Why is this information useful to support your interpretation, your view of the phenomenon? No, because otherwise, yes, it's useful information, but then I wonder, how do I connect the dots? And while you have to, you have to drive the reader through your story and support the reader, especially if the reader, like me, is not an expert of the topics, but has some experience, how to say, some general knowledge of international relations, international politics. Now, when it comes to your empirical section, so it arises, and it's quite, I felt that it was quite disconnected from the previous part, mainly because a proper theoretical part at the moment is somehow missing. No, you don't articulate your hypotheses that connect, let's say, the first part of the paper to the empirical section. Okay. Then I write here and I read about country level variation in ICT policy adoption, which is fine, but what do you mean exactly with it? So what's the variation about? Variation in which terms? And what are the hypotheses that support, as I said, this choice, this empirical choice? What are the possible problems in studying these issues? Empirical problems, I mean, in terms of research design, and how do you solve them? How do you address them? These are all issues that need to be present in the part of the paper in which you explain your empirical strategy and your proper research design. For instance, give some real world meaning. Provide some examples. On top of page 8, you say the average ICT regulator tracker score significantly improved in the time span from 2007 to 2018. Very interesting, but what does it mean in practice, in real world terms? Because it's a very composite index, 50 indexes, added together. So what does it mean if it increases over time? What does this tell us for international politics or for the public policy world of these countries, if you want? Independent variables. Why these variables? They seem, at least to a lay observer, at least to an ignorant observer, they seem somehow reasonable. Reasonable. Foreign direct investment, fine, but Why? No, since you haven't clearly proposed your approach, the reader, you know, is somehow left like, okay, it seems reasonable, but why these flows and not, I don't know, international trade, for instance? Might make no sense, but as I said, just, you know, to be clear. Then I have some more some comments on the empirical part. You say, we introduce one time lag in order to exclude reciprocal effects between the dependent and explanatory variable, which is the old and problematic issue that we call reverse causality. I'm not sure it's enough. Sometimes it's not enough, but it's okay. And it's good that you acknowledge this problem, and it's much better than doing nothing. So it's fine. But what are the countries involved in the analysis? All the countries in the world? If not, which countries are missing and why? Is it because of the data? Is it because of a conscious choice of the researchers? You need to provide more details about the research design, what enters your analysis, what remains out of your analysis, and so on. Then we opted for a mean of 6 consecutive years. I'm not sure I understand why. Even in this case, I'm not saying it's wrong, but you need to provide more information on the reasons why you decided this, because otherwise it looks a bit arbitrary. Why 6 and not 5, for instance? Then I see the point of fluctuations, but if this is a field, I'm not an expert, but if this is a field in which things move fast, maybe you should use a time series cross-section? Question mark. I leave it there. I don't know. But this is something you could consider. Results. Even in this case, fine, but provide some concrete measure, concrete feeling. The model showed that the net official development aid received has a negative effect of minus 0.01635 on the mean of on the mean of ICT regulatory tracker ratios in subsequent 6 years. Cool, but what does it mean in real terms? You know what I mean? Quantities of interest, if it's possible. Otherwise, just provide some more, real examples for us. And finally, a few more comments. Why do you show only one model? What happens if you change the features of these models? What happens if you exclude some variables and or include others? As I said, I'm not an expert of the topic, but I assume that someone can come up with alternative possible explanatory variables or control variables, such as, I don't know, membership in international organizations or alliances between China and some of these countries. No. So what happens if you modify the single model that you show? Then I'm afraid that you're using maybe too many variables at the same time for a number of observations that you have in this first section, and some of them might be correlated. So I would suggest you at least, again, clarify, at least show the descriptive statistics and a simple table of correlation in the appendix, between all the variables, so that we know that is not the case. What else?
Can
yes,
we maybe?
And I'll leave it there because.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefano. I think that there were many things that are very important for Stephanie, but the few things that you said are important for all the junior scholars that we have. today, particularly the idea that you have to have a strong connection between a research question, the theory and the cases and the empirics. And this doesn't go only for those who are doing quantitative studies. Of course, the quantitative methodology will drive you in that direction because you have to sort of flesh out more clearly the variables to put them in a regression, so to speak. But this is a very valuable suggestion also for those who are doing qualitative analysis. Okay, this is very important for everyone, especially at the beginning, and especially when they write a paper, conference paper, or something that would try to be published, to be very clear, particularly in the connection between research question and theory and analysis later on. So that is particularly important. That being said, if someone has questions, please raise your hand and then speak. I will say just one thing before, just a very short comment on Stephanie's paper. Do you insist at the end that European Union and China might be partners? But actually, more than partners, it seems that their role is complementary. Partners mean actually cooperating. In this case, in your conclusion, you seem to say there are areas where there is China, there are areas where there's the EU, rather than factual cooperation. And one small detail on this is that China is using a policy of military and civilian fusion, which has been in the last years one of the key policies in terms of putting together the military and the civilian side. And particularly on new technologies, this is important. And I guess that since the European Union policymakers are aware of that, the actual cooperation that we can expect on these issues is relatively low and probably decline. This was just my brief observation, and I will leave the floor to Professor Quaglia that has a comment.
Yes, exactly. So I very much enjoyed the presentation. I apologize, I didn't read the paper. I just want to reinforce the point made by the discussant and then by Matteo, that this is what I felt it was somewhat missing. The empirical analysis was very interesting and has a lot of potential. But then it needs to be underpinned by a theoretical framework, and therefore I felt that traditional literature review or state of the art was somewhat missing, and in particular the theoretical frame or the theoretical, if you want, approach should be spelled out at the outset in the presentation. So I felt it was missing not so much from the presentation, the literature review, but at least the theoretical framework, hypothesis, expectations should be there. And just one small question for you to think about, or actually something that is of interest to me, and I want to ask you. You mentioned at the very end of your presentation the importance, or at least hinted at, international standard setting. And that's, for example, a field in which the European Union is quite strong, in particular in the electronic equipment. So I was wondering whether, not so much for the paper, because you can't kill too many birds with one stone, but whether for your presentation you will be looking at the influence of the European Union and China on international standard setting. And I'm thinking about, for example, the work by Wute and Matley on indeed pointing out the influence of the European Union in international standard setting, even vis-a-vis the US, which we usually consider as a leader in the world politics and world economy. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. If you want to take, Stephanie, a minute just to react to some of these things. Of course, there is a lot of suggestions, a lot of comments. If there's something you wish to address very briefly, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your really helpful comments, Professor Costalli. I took a lot of notes, and I think they're really very valuable and helpful comments. Just very briefly on your suggestion to perhaps change and adopt a time series cross-section analysis. This is actually something I am seriously considering, and this summer I'm attending a summer school in this direction. So I hope to improve the analysis from that point of view. As for the choice of explanatory variables, especially with regards to the economic variables, I agree that there's a lot to be improved. I so far included just a few of them because I was considering the parsimony of the analysis. But something I will include next and that I will consider next is definitely the membership in international organizations. Also because I need to find a mechanism that sort of explains why this is the case. And I think if I start looking at the memberships and in international organizations, and what I also want to do is to perhaps divide the macro regions differently. As of now, they're perhaps way too aggregate, and to some extent also there's a lot of within group variation in some of the macro regions. So I think this could significantly improve the analysis after all. As to Professor Dian's comment on whether they are partner or on whether the European Union and China are partners or actually just complementary actors, I completely agree. I think this is a very, I haven't thought of it before, but in fact, I think it's rather complementary than partners. There's not a lot of mutual or agreed action in developing countries, but it's rather, well, where the European Union is absent, China jumps in or simply has a bigger effect than where the European Union is more present. This is what I found so far. And to just briefly address Professor Quaglia's comment, so thank you very much also for your suggestion. As with regards to the international standard setting, I think so. Whether the European Union, the US, or China have the most influence is not a central part of my dissertation, but I think it definitely also plays a role. What I am particularly concerned about is what their role is in developing countries, what their effect is on developing countries. So I will consider it to some extent, but not really from the perspective of the European Union, for example, but more from the perspective of the global South, so to say. I hope this more or less answered some of your questions. Again, this is just very brief and I took a lot of notes. So thank you so much. And thank you also very much for this opportunity.
So the title is quite straightforward. It's voting with their wallet, economic dependence on China and South American voting in the UNGA. Basically, our research question is whether South American countries with a high economic dependence on China display a higher degree of voting coincidence with China in the United Nations General Assembly. But later on in the work, we will try also to address another research question, a sub-research question, which is whether they are steering away from the United States lead, meaning the United States pattern of voting in the UNGA over certain relevant issues when they vote like China. And I will here mention some of the literature on the topic, and then Carlo will go more we'll go deeper in the methodology and all the research design. So basically, we start from all the literature on China's rise. So all the literature on how much China is going global, how much China is globalizing its ambitions, and so how much China is reaching new and unprecedented areas and regions where he had never had any interest or never kept its foot. But then also there is a sub-literature on all the spillover effect between the economic and the political domain. And this is something that Matteo Dian also has already mentioned when he mentioned the MCF, the military civil fusion strategy, which is a sort of integration between different domains. And so there is a possible political spillover of economic processes. But then also there is something more when we talk about South America, which is of course the literature on is South America still the America's backyard? or Washington's hegemony is fading out somehow in the process. And then the third major literature strand is, of course, the one related to the UNGA per se. So the UNGA and its procedures and its work and its voting patterns. And these are the three major literature we address. So logically, we expect some finding from a preliminary standpoint. For example, we expect dealing with the data preliminarily and starting to handle the data, we expect to see weak but still existing patterns of voting of correlation between voting coincidence with China and high dependence of the South American country on China. But we also expect to see a lower degree of voting coincidence by the same highly dependent countries on China when it comes to voting on the so-called important votes as they are defined by the US Department of State, which are votes that the United States consider to be really important to US national interest, but also to US values and US values and beliefs. And so we expect, but this is something that of course we will see in the making. I heard someone with the mic on. Okay, I will keep on. And this is something that we will try to see if it works. We expect to see a still limited sway of Beijing's over South American countries. And I want to highlight this. This is a tentative thing that we're working on. So it is a very working paper, a very preliminary work, and we will try to. This is sorry, yeah. And one of our objectives is try to give a measure of how much China is rising economically and how much is able to convert economic influence, economic dependence into political influence. And then also try to give some kind of measure of how much is the United States grip over South American states' foreign policy when it comes to the UNGA. And we also know that, and then I will leave the floor to Carlo, we also know that this is just one very first step for more in-depth, case-sensitive, qualitative research on China and South America. So this is it, and I will leave the floor to my friend and colleague, Carlo.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, everyone. So I am going to employ my time here just to mention something about our methodology that, again, is really tentative and preliminary at the moment. We have probably more doubt than certainty at the moment. And I think Professor Quaglia has, by reading the paper, got an idea of these ongoing and tentative nature of the paper. So basically, as Lorenzo was saying, our paper will be about trying to determine whether there is a correlation or covariation between the level of economic dependence of South American countries on China and their voting coincidence at UNGA, where the voting coincidence at the UNGA is basically a proxy for political alignment, which is, of course, something questionable, of course, but it has already been employed widely in the literature, dedicated not only to China's influence, but also to US influence with other countries. In terms of methodology, our study is, of course, a small land design studies in that we focus on South America specifically. So we have a limited number of cases, which of course gives us some advantages in the way we deal with individual cases from within the region, but also some disadvantages and in particular in terms of causal inference and in the possibility to go quantitatively and apply some statistical model. So the idea we have come up at the moment, and we are working on at the moment, is to take a comparative approach. And in particular, the idea is to compare South American countries on the independent variable, that is the level of economic dependence, and to show and analyze the variation and differences and discrepancies among each South American country, and then to compare and to verify if these variation and differences overlap with the variation and differences on the dependent variable. And of course, our preliminary hypothesis is that some correlation has to be found. And of course, this hypothesis is derived from the literature on the topic. So basically, our idea is to proceed in this way, from the to look firstly at the economic variable, and then going to the political one. So in terms of the, we can, yeah, 1 second, we go to next slide. Yeah. So in terms of the way we operationalize the two variables, of course, we do not come up with a new or original definition of economic dependence. There's a wide literature on this on this topic. We are going to operationalize this variable by looking at two different components. We are going to measure the weight that the commercial relationship with China has for each South American country and for each South American economy. And then we are going to refine this concept by looking in particular at the export concentration of each South American country. So we are going to try to determine how much of the total export of each South American countries has gone to China. And here we follow Hirschman definition of trade dependency. And basically the idea is, of course, that the higher these two ratios and the higher the level of dependency of the each South American country. Then we are also planning to add another component to this definition, in particular to look at the financial dimension and to verify whether the financial and commercial dimension overlap, and whether those countries that have traded more with China and rely more on China have also been those countries that have received more financing, investment, and loans from Chinese companies and Chinese policy banks. And the idea, therefore, is to analyze the region on this dimension and to get a really nuanced and really varied picture of the region. And the idea then is to go to the other variables. To next slide. For the voting coincidence, or the dependent variable. The idea is to employ the definition, as Lorenzo was saying, employed by the Department of State. So voting coincidence is basically the number of times two countries have casted identical votes over the total number of votes expressed by those countries during each UNGA session. And we are going to calculate this index for basically each South American countries with China. And we are going to, again, look at the differences and variation among regional actors. Then the idea, and this is probably one of the possible contribution of our paper, is the way we analyze these votes, because we are going to start from all the votes and the resolution adopted by the UNGA, but we are going to refine this category, and we are going to concentrate in particular for China on the votes related to human rights issues, where it is more where Chinese interests are considered to be at stake on many issues, and where so the position of South American countries can be considered more revealing of the overall foreign policy orientation. But then we are going to add another element that it might sound probably is not correct to use this expression, but as a form of control, we are going to look also at South American coincidence with the United States. And we are going to introduce another category of votes, which is the so-called important votes mentioned by Lorenzo. And on this third stage of the research, we are going to verify whether countries that have traded more with China, have coincided more with China, have also tended to disalign from the United States. That again, for the case of South America, is a particular and will be a particular significant finding or significant evidence. And so we are going to add this component in a later stage of the research. So just the last thing on the dependent variable is, well, I have already mentioned it. The thing is, we are going to employ this index or this indicator as a proxy for political alignment. Of course, we reckon that this indicator has several limitations, and of course, not every component of one country's foreign policy can be described by this single indicator. But at the same time, we recognize that in the literature.
Carlo, do you mind getting towards the conclusion?
Yeah, just that the voting coincidence is has already been employed in the literature, and scholars have already found an important coincidence also for the United States between economic influence and political influence through this indicator.
So first of all, thank you very much for the paper, and I very much enjoyed reading it. This paper sets out to contribute to the literature on China and South America relations, and also US-South America relations, and also feeds into the broader debate on the rise of China in the global economy, but also in the new political order. So let me start with sort of my suggestion are with the head of a reviewer on. So first suggestion will be in the introduction, start with an empirical puzzle or a theoretical puzzle or a paradox that would entice the reader to read your paper, and also that your paper then sets out to explain. Now, it's quite, in a way, I would say normal that the puzzle comes to the author's mind once the paper has been completed. So it's absolutely understandable that it's not there at this stage, and it's not, I would say, a necessary part, but it's always a good selling point in the introduction of a paper, of an article, to have a puzzle or a paradox. So start thinking now, and in particular, once you have completed the analysis, what is the puzzling, either theoretical outcome or an empirical one that you want to highlight in the introduction. The second point is about the structure of the paper. And here I should say that I found the presentation a bit better structured than the paper, and at least clear in terms of, organization of the different parts of the paper. So it's not written in stone, but usually in the second section of a paper, there is the traditional literature review or state of the art, however you want to call it. And then there is an outline of the theoretical framework that will be used in the paper, hypotheses, empirically observable implications, and so on. Now, in the paper, the one you have circulated, this material is in section 4, at least in the way I read the paper, but correct me if I'm wrong. Whereas the current section 1 is something of a hybrid. So I think the title is section 2 is China's economic rise and the political nexus and the UN General Assembly. So that's your current section 2, whereas the reader would expect to find more of discussion of the literature and theoretical framework, research design, discussion of the research methodology. Then when I listened to your presentation and also looking at some of the citations you have in the current section 2, China's economic rise, I understand that you mean that section as a state-of-the-art or a short review of the literature on China's economic rise. And then you have a further, if you want, review of the literature in section 4. So that is a bit confusing, and regardless of whether my interpretation is correct or not about, if you want, the function of section 2, and in particular the position it has in the paper, some of the works you cite there are a bit selective, and they are not really about China. So that section is a bit undercited, under reference, which is absolutely normal because it's work in progress. But then, you know, the sort of the 4, if you want, references or citations, where you want to call a standout there, are Hirschman, 1945, Dresner, 2009, and then Farrell and Newman, 2019. And I think actually there might be a couple of extra citations, but these are all the works you cite there. So my suggestion, really strategic one, is that section need to be a bit better referenced, also because you might have some potential reviewers who have actually written on China and the world economy or the new global order, and therefore they will be very familiar with the literature in that section. So to me, just to sort of, I don't know, this point, it was a bit surprising to have these old citations. They're about 50 years apart, about 1945, 2009, and 2019. And then at least explain why you picked up these works, but not other works on China or whatever economic interdependence. Then third point is about alternative explanations. So I was wondering whether in a subsequent reiteration of the paper, in a sort of an updated draft, you will be considering alternative explanation. At the moment, your main explanation is economic interdependence, and I would encourage you to engage with also potential alternative explanation, at least a couple of them. The first one that comes to my mind, and I'm not really an expert in this field, is related to economic interdependence, but it's not the same thing, and is also very trendy at the moment, and is the concept of weaponized interdependence by Farrell and Newman. And to be fair, you do cite their work indeed in section 2, but then you don't pick up on this point. So alternative explanation, first one, economic weaponized interdependence, or at least another couple of explanations that you will either engage with in the empirical analysis, or if you don't want to do so, you should still discuss them in section 2 when you review, discuss this potential explanation, explain why they don't really fit the empirical material you have or the case studies you're looking at. Then final point is about the methodology. So here, let me start by saying I'm not an expert in quantitative methods, so I am unable to comment on that. I was just wondering, and actually this is really a question to you in order to improve my understanding of quantitative methods, is whether the covariance analysis you plan to use might enable to control not only for other factors, but also potentially to test for alternative explanation, just a couple of them. And also, how would you deal with the potential problem that correlation doesn't mean causation? So I think in your research design, your independent variable is economic dependence, and you assume that if it varies, then the dependent variable, which is voting coincidence, will vary likewise. But then how do we know that there is causation from the independent variable to the dependent one, and it's not simply a case of correlation. So I think I shall stop here, and I look forward to your comments or explanation. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Quaglia for comments. They were very stimulating, and I'm sure very useful for the two authors to improve their paper. If there is any other question, please raise your hand. We have Mirek, who is a first-year PhD student in Bologna. Please, Mirek.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a couple of maybe interesting points for you, because actually I've been now working with a colleague of mine on a UNGA analysis, but we use social network analysis approach. But actually, I think that quite some of the things that you mentioned will be quite similar in our paper as well. So we are interested in regional dynamics and voting communities at the UNGA through time coming together and or diverging, etc. And we went through several rounds of reviews because we want to present the paper at some conferences. And I think that some of the comments we got from the reviewers apply also to your case. So I'm thinking maybe it could be good for you to think about them. The first one is that if you want to study the UNGA as a sort of proxy for the relationship between states, the problem with this specific international body is that there is a very specific dynamics in terms of voting in the institution. So especially if you want to check for whether the Latin American countries are somehow getting farther away from the US and coming closer to China, the problem is that especially the position of the US at the UNGA is very, very isolated, marginal. If you check the similarity rates of their votes and you disregard basically the consensual votes, it's the US and Israel that are very specific in the structure of the voting. The same goes for China, which is much closer to the G77 group. But the problem is that the US and also China, they also sometimes vote very specifically because of their position at the Security Council. So what I'm saying is that there are some internal dynamics why states hold certain positions, and even in the case that the US considered the case, whatever, Palestinian refugee crisis or Middle East politics, very important, they don't deal with it through the UNGA. So they prefer different channels of doing or dealing with these issues. So you won't get that in the similarity rates for the votes. My second point was you should definitely check for a regional effect. So what we found in our data, but again, our approach is slightly different. We do network analysis, but what we found is that the regional effect is much stronger than, for instance, the economic effects, meaning states tend to vote according to what their neighbors are doing, and you have this regional dynamics. The best case in point is the EU, right? That coordinates the vote before you actually go to the UNGA and vote. And something similar seems to be happening also with the ASEAN countries and Mercosur countries. So you should definitely check for that. And one more suggestion, if you want to have a look, there is a paper written by Brito, Silvia, and Amancio in 2020. It's called, let me find it, the name, it's called A Complex Network Approach to Political Analysis, Application to the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies. So it's not really the UNGA, and it's network analysis again. But at the beginning of the paper, if you check the methodological part, they construct a way how to calculate the similarity rate of countries voting the same. And you can easily adopt it to the UNGA. You basically take the same approach. In a nutshell, what you do is you create a vector for each country. And you assign the value of 1 if the country votes yes, the value of -1 if it votes no. And then the big issue is how you deal with absentees and abstentions, if you take them the same, or is it 0 or what? That's really fun. How to deal with this. But the point is that, and I'll finish just 30 more seconds. The point is that then if you multiply the vectors and you divide by the total sum of resolutions, you get a nice weighted connection between two countries. And you can easily use the same data set as you mentioned and do it throughout the time. So maybe you want to have a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirek. This is super interesting and great comments. And I guess you guys have a lot to discuss even after the conference, and it is also why we do this type of conference and seminars. If there's any other question, please raise your hand.
I see a message in the chat. Sorry.
Okay, so sorry. Let me see the chat a second. Otherwise, Sofia Leodori, please, and then yes, it was Sofia. So.
Yes, thank you very much. Briefly, thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting, especially because focusing on the US, I usually nowadays look at the shift in the international environment of power between US and China. But I wanted to ask a question about your economic data. The first data you mentioned at the beginning of the paper as an economic dependence of the South American countries you're looking at. You only mentioned the export percentage, and I wanted to ask you if you thought about looking also at the import-export balance, and also maybe at, because you of course make a mirroring between the shift of the hegemonic power of the US at the UNGA, and also between the capability of the US to influence economically those countries. So maybe it would be interesting to look at the historical economic data about the dependence of those countries from the US, and then the shift from depending from the US to depending to China. And that's just this.
Thank you, Sophia, for your comment. Before closing, I would just suggest you one name to look at, which is Carne Fung, which is someone that has done a lot of research on China and the UN at the University of Hong Kong. And I will leave you just a couple of minutes, Lorenzo and Carlo, to address some of the comments. Of course, many of those things were general and things that you have to sort of reflect on. But if you want to take really a couple of minutes to answer, please feel free to do so.
Thank you very much. I think we can go in the same order. So I will take just 1 minute, and then Carlo maybe can follow up. So I will go ascending. So from the last to the first. Sophia, thank you very much for your observations. Yeah, actually, Carlo and I are wondering which indicators should fit better for economic dependence, especially for the independent variable, because we are still working on which is the best one. If export on total export with China on to China on total export, or trade with China on GDP, or as you mentioned, the trade balance, and we're still working on that, and we will of course include your observation into the process. And then Mirek, you had so many good points and observation and suggestion. Of course, UNGA as a proxy could be, in some way could be hard. Maybe we should consider some control variable to be sure that we're picking the right strings, and not observing, for example, the strings where the US is so isolated, and the South American states are free to wander wherever they want, because they don't feel the lead. They don't follow the lead. So probably, we will explore that. And then I think it's really interesting, the regional effects that you've mentioned. I'm not so sure that regional effects undermine our reasoning, our argument. Actually, it could reinforce the argument if we check that regional organizations multiply the kind of political influence of China that we are studying. I don't know, but it is just something so preliminary. And then thank you for the suggestion, the paper suggestion. We will check then on complex networks. And then of course, Thank you, Professor Dian, also for the heads up on Congo University professor. We will check that. And then, of course, last but not least, Professor Quaglia, thank you very much for all your comments and observations. They are very much thorough, and we will check on those. For the last one, causation is not correlation. That is so correct, and actually, we're still working on whether we want in the first place to explore causation, or we just want to rule out if there is a correlation between those two variables. So we're still in the very shallow exploration of the topic. We don't even know if we want to go deeper and to try to assess causation. And we actually mentioned at the end of the presentation that we could work on this article as a preliminary baseline for future more in-depth, case-sensitive articles on the same topic.
Okay, here we are. So yeah, thank you, Professor Dia, for the introduction. My name is Flavia Lucenti, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Roma III. Today, I would like to discuss with you about a research paper that I'm still writing, which I'm still working on, that is titled China Threat, an unnecessary forward-looking posture. Indeed, the paper is about the perception of China as a threat that evolved by the narrative that was given the narrative that was elaborated by the United States in very recent year, which I define as a necessary posture, because one of the main points of this article is that this kind of narrative, both sides, namely China and the United States, to mutually adopt an excessive hostile posture. The theoretical framework is that of the social theory of international relations, in particular constructivism. Because the constructivist paradigm allows to investigate the impact of international variables such as ideas, feelings, emotion, and above all images, that the main variable that this article investigates. Well, the effect of this variable on international politics. Images here are defined as representation of reality, and the type of imaging that I'm going to investigate in this article is that the imaging that describe politics, but on the base on bias and stereotypes. And moreover, the constructivist paradigm is useful to investigate, to conduct a narrative type inquiry on which this article is based on. But I decided also to intertwine the social theory of IR with the social and social psychological theories, in particular with the theory of the stereotypes and the stereotypes trap. Indeed, the conclusion of the article is that if some imaging, mostly the imaging that are founded on bias and stereotypes, are systematically evoked in the political debate, this can be converted from a mere speculation into reality. So, well, the China's threat narrative mainly developed through the use of two images that are very common in very recent years, that are that one of the Thucydides trap and that of the new Cold War. And the use of this images mostly intensifying, starting from Xi Jinping's second mandate, as a concentration of political power occurred in his hand, to which follows a revival of an assertive posture of China on the international scene, which contribute to raise concern of the West about China as a threat to the liberal world. Well, let's start by the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap was an expression that gained the attention of the public at large, mainly starting from 2017, when the realist scholar Graham Allison published a book titled Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Indeed, the main thesis elaborated by Allison was that China would pose an inevitable challenge to the United States, as in the past Athens did with Sparta, and also other rising power did with the hegemonic power. In this way, Allison described the cycle of the rise and fall of great power as a sort of an inescapable process. And according to my interpretation, this expression was particularly successful because it provided an interpretation of international politics that merely rationalized the Western anxiety. Because is sound to the Western public at large as a sort of reliable model to describe China posture toward the United States and more broadly towards the West. Indeed, right in those years, China was showing a mounting assertive attitude that contributed to turn all the scholars and commentators who speak about the China's threat as a sort of a near prophecy, as the situation that she writes about was getting more real and real. The other image is that of a new Cold War, that also developed out together with that of the cities trap. And in particular, this kind of image is relevant because it shares the idea that the world was on the verge of a new Cold War, which this time seemed China as the rival to the United States, which has been transforming indeed in very recent years into a recurring topic, not just by politicians, but also a recurring expression that we can find in headlines of many articles and in the academia publication, but also on journal and in newspapers. Well, the intensification of the battle of narrative between China and the United States indeed had intensified in the very recent year, as it was marked by mutual allegation that many interpret as the precondition for open rivalry between these two powers that contribute to the development of this expression of a new Cold War. Albeit it was for many reasons an improper interpretation of politics. First of all, because the idea of the Cold War actually involved also the perception and, well, involved the assumption that there is a concrete a threat based on the use of nuclear weapons by the both sides, as actually was the Cold War between the United States and the USSR. And this is something that it was not happening now. But it was in any way very recalled in many expressions, in many situations, and it has one collateral effect that is placing the United States and China competition to the framework of an ideological battle as a struggle for the soul of the world that the United States should win. And in this perspective, the Trump administration have its own responsibility, as it was very common among the members of the Trump administration, this idea that if the United States would not prevail over China, China in 15 years would have been able to take the hegemony of the world and share its own value and its own vision of the world to the rest of the world. Indeed, also the Trump narrative contribute to this idea of China as a threat for the liberal world. And what was important of the Trump narrative was the fact that in his rhetoric, Trump not just defined China as a threat to the liberal world by reprimand China for violating human rights or for smothering Hong Kong, but remarkably, Trump turned China into a threat also for the people who live in the states, in liberal states, by saying that China was spying on Western users of TikTok, indeed violating people's privacy and infecting the world, putting at risk everyone's health. And obviously it encouraged also a reaction, an hostile reaction by China. And it has a result that of the use of an hostile language by both sides. Indeed, in the last 2 years, it's very common to hear about this so-called World War diplomacy. Indeed, a more aggressive posture that was encouraged by the government of Beijing to defend, according to the fighting spirit of the nation, the interest of China. And this is this type of diplomacy also found room in the social network, especially on Twitter, that actually is forbidden in China, but that the government authorized its spokesperson to use it in order to reply and to defend China's interest. And reply to the reprimand that come from the West. And this battle narrative that found room, especially on Twitter, intensified, especially with the outburst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, Trump and Pompeo use very often expression like the Wuhan virus of the China's virus in order to describe the COVID-19 virus that China perceived as something that was very racist and a product of a bias that the West nurtured in the regard of China. And as a reaction, China also began to describe the United States as a country that was led by a president that was not responsible, and that spread fake news on how to cure the COVID-19 pandemic that in an incipient phase is also denied. So all this contribute to shift the relation between China and the United States from a deep competition to a sharp confrontation. This is the Twitter that I mentioned before that was shared on Twitter by Xinhua, that is the Chinese press agency, on March 2020, that indeed demonstrate how a sort of schizophrenia by Trump that turned his idea on how China was managing the pandemic, passing from saying that he appreciated how China was containing the virus into its border, and when the virus arrived in the United States, began to reproach China and to accuse China also for demonstrate few transparency on the spread of the virus. So the point was that once this kind of hostile language is set, is something that is very hard to be reversed. Indeed, despite the efforts of which we are seeing since today by President Trump to find a new way, a new dialogue with China. Indeed, Biden not talk anymore about China as an enemy, but he defined China as the most serious competitor in the United States. Well, it's very hard to come back to the pre-Trump situation. Albeit indeed Biden was the idea that the Biden administration was completely different is completely different from the one adopted by Trump administration. Indeed, the main idea of Biden administration was that the United States must learn to coexist with China, whether it likes it or not, because China is a superpower and China is here now on the international stage. So we cannot deny its presence. But the United States have to try to derive more benefits than disadvantages from this coexistence with China. However, as I said before, the dialogue is still hostile as a conflictual environment based on reciprocal distrust and blame has been established, and has been established also by the use of this image of which I've talked before, and that is now seems very hard to be reversed. One of the main proof of that has been given during the high-level meeting in Alaska in early 2020, when on one hand, the United States with Blinken accused China for being a liberal state, but China also react by saying that the United States are a bully and hypocrite actor in the international scene. And in order to demonstrate this, China refers to the mistreat of the American.
Flavia, do you mind going towards the conclusion?
Yeah,
you would have a minute more.
Yeah. I'll come to the conclusion. Well, the main point is that we are insisting on an intensification on the hostility and of the rivalry between the United States and China. The point is that is a concretization of an expected scenario, or it's just a stereotypes that is turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, a sociological approach says us that prophecies become self-fulfilling whenever the agents tend to frame what happened in a context which they are familiar with, as if the action contributed to the occurrence of an event that originally was only supposed. So in this way, the imaging that described China as a threat, the narrative of China as a threat can be considered as a less trustworthy story, and also a story that may be distorting the facts, as is not really a realization of someone that has been predicting the theory, but a consequence of an attitude, namely that of treating China as a threat because the West has fear of losing its hegemonic position. So the main conclusion is that probably is not really advantages for the scholar, but even for politicians to discuss about the rise of China always as a struggle for the hegemony, because it induced to disregard the sense of other ways of narrating international politics and of interpreting the posture of Beijing far from the condition of the present political debate that see China as an actor, when maybe there are other ways to see what the behavior of China on international scene, for example, as an actor that seeks an increasing plurality and not just a struggle for the hegemony. So this is one of the main conclusion of my paper. And one last point is that the use of this kind of narrative and image has the risk of producing uncertain and unpredictable consequences in the interaction among power, as when we recall feeling like distrust and fears, this can preclude major power from engaging in a positive path towards cooperation. Thank you.
I was saying thank you very much, Flavia, for your presentation. I think the topic is extraordinarily important for contemporary international politics. One minor thing, do you mind taking away? Yes, thank you. I was saying it's very important to address these issues. And I think you take it an interesting angle as well, because it is also important to move away from just the analysis of policies or security and economic dimension and take a serious look at the narrative side and the representation that the two countries have of each other, moving on to as compared to those theories that would assume that this is inevitable and it's purely material. And of course, that is the side of structural realism and Thucydides trap and all that. And considering how those ideas and those perceptions matter in the bilateral relation. So my first point would be, for this paper, do you say social approach and constructivist approach? I think this is a post-structuralist approach and a critical approach that you would need to use clearly. And of course, a choice of this kind would lead you in a certain direction in terms of where to publish, how to frame the article, and a number of other things. But I think this is really of its critical theory. It's post-structuralism rather than constructivism, because at the end, your point is about narrative, and therefore you would need a theory of international politics that says that II is mostly about discourse and narrative, at least in the extent you are doing this research and looking at representations more than anything else. And of course, saying that those representations matter and they are crucial. So that would be the first point. The second point would be, you are getting close to theories that exist, that are very interesting, that you might want to look at when you discuss political psychology, anxiety, and so on. Try to look at ontological security. So the idea that's been put forward by Jennifer Midzen, used by others on China, for instance, Carl Gustafsson in Stockholm is doing that. That would be probably interesting to look at. So that is one side. And the other important bibliographical suggestion that I will give you is Oliver Turner in Edinburgh. There is a book called American Images of China, 2014, published by Routledge. I will give you the references later. So that for the theory. The other important thing that we need to discuss is probably agent and structures. Very often we tend to attribute a discontinuity to Trump that is not entirely Trumpian. The ship, which has been very strong, very coherent, and involved basically the entire foreign policy community in the United States on China, has been shocking and impressive seen from the outside. If you read Obama's book, The Biography of the First Mandate, he mentions China once and only in terms of cooperation. which is funny if you read it from the spirit of today. And the shift happened during the Trump administration, but not necessarily just for the Trump administration. I mean, the entire sort of Washington bubble has moved on that. People perfectly in mainstream, Republicans and Democratic alike, Brookings, CSIS, I mentioned the names that you want, mainstream people that has completely changed approach towards China. So that is the interesting point, and see, okay, Trump has driven the change, but then all the rest followed. Even if the same people thought that Trump was anti-mainstream, was a populist, was against the American interest, they moved on China, and they favored that change. So a good question would be, why is that? Not necessarily for this specific paper, but will be interesting to understand the relationship between agent destruction in this sense. And we are talking, of course, about normative agents in this case, not necessarily structure in words and terms. And how this thing was easier to do because it fitted a certain image of what the United States are and what the United States do. So the populist part was really harder to implement because it didn't fit certain beliefs that were present in Washington. While the new Cold War part was slightly easier to promote because it sort of fit in the idea of the American hegemony is threatened by a foreign power, which is non-democratic. So the Americans have to step up and save the world again. Okay, in a narrative term, that part of the Trumpian foreign policy fit much better than all the rest. Okay, so that is interesting. And the other point is the difference between Biden and Trump. What is fascinating is that Biden is not deviating that much. In terms of tone, yes, of course. But the rhetoric and, if you wish, the ideology that Biden is employing is even more functional to a Cold War style of narrative. I mean, not explicitly Cold War in the sense of confrontation, zero-sum game, but it's much more in the mainstream Wilsonian. We are democratic, we have values that we share with our allies, multilateralism, and so on. So again, the shift that has happened is not shifting back. We're not seeing Obama 2.0 here. We are seeing something slightly different, and that difference has a lot to do with that shift that has happened 17, 18, 19, and then made stronger by the pandemic. I will stop here. I will have much more to say about this because I'm very passionate about US-China relations, but I will definitely leave space for your answers. But before, of course, if we have questions from the public. Anyone? So if I don't see questions here at the moment, and so if you want to react to some of these comments, and otherwise we are approaching lunchtime, so we hope to close by 1.
Thank you, Professor Dian, for all your valuable suggestions. Well, and thank you for the suggestion about the theoretical part. Maybe we will speak about that later because yeah, you're right. Probably the post-structural and critical approach are fitting much better with the theoretical framework and with the case study that I want to demonstrate here in this research paper. Well, about the idea of the China threat that to which Trump administration just contribute, not really provoke as first triggering factor, we should say. Yeah, I agree. Indeed, one of the main points of this article that probably at this stage does not emerge is that the share of these images by the public at large contribute to the perception of China as a threat. I mean, Trump used this in his favor, but he did not create it, not create this image, but these images were already there. And they were so successful because people partially already believe in the idea that China could threaten their way of living and the way of representing the world. So I think that this is the point of strength of these images, that academia use it and that people follow, as also because they were shared by commentators and by pundits of international politics. On the new Cold War and the fact that really Biden is not really deviated by this approach that began by this intensification of the tension that to which Trump mainly contributed to. Yeah, I think that is true that Trump is not deviating, but on different reasons. I mean, Trump wants to use this image of China as a threat in order to create somewhat different role for the United States in the world. And it was somehow a consequence of the political disengagement followed by Trump. Biden Reagan was doing, the same thing, but with the opposite, with the I would say, with very different reason. Biden wanted to restore the role of the United States as protector and guarantor of the liberal values, because he understood, he has demonstrated a major awareness that the role of hegemonic of the United States is based on this capacity, this ability to rule the world, a rule that has to be based on the international law and on liberal values. So in order to do this, he has to post China, because China is an illiberal state. But it doesn't mean that a competition should be inevitable. And this is something that is much more linked with the use of the language done by Trump and this style of diplomacy. That is not what Biden was doing. Indeed, Biden is a man of the Obama administration, and in this we can find some similarities.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Sofia Eliodori. Please, Sofia.
Yes, thank you. So more than a question, is a comment, because we have some linkages between my research and your research. So it is very interesting, the framing you gave, the dual framing. And I was thinking about framing United States confrontation with China as a new Cold War, which is abusively used in literature nowadays, because in fact Trump reframed, in my opinion, the role of the US and the confrontation with China differently, because Cold War necessitates of other countries to take a stand, to be on one side or the other side, while Trump didn't actually ask allies to take a stand. I think that Biden is doing right now, asking especially European countries to take a stand against China in some issues. So I guess this is particularly interesting and something to provide more research about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. That I think was very important. And that, for instance, happened, if some of you was present, in December, we had a meeting with the director for the policy planning staff of the State Department at the University of Bologna. And Professor Lucarelli and I were discussing that presentation of an important foreign policy document on China called the China Challenge. That was indeed framing the confrontation in Cold War terms. And you saw the disconnection there with Dr. Berkowitz at the time started to argue basically our allies should be on our side because China is a revisionist country. What came out was indeed that on our side, we didn't see things in the same way. And we didn't appreciate the metaphor at all, because the Cold War frame creates more problems for us than what it serves, while it's really helpful for the United States, for instance, in terms of mobilizing resources. Any other question? Or Flavia, do you want to react to this very briefly?
Yeah, thank you for your comment. Well, I think, but this is just a suggestion. I think that what is really interesting now is trying to understand, we are a scholar and researcher, trying to understand why Trump used this type of narrative, why he felt the need of reduce every confrontation he had with every actor on the international scene as like reduce this to a friend enemy perspective. I mean, is it something that depends on his character and his personal inclination, or it has some strategic aims that personally I cannot see now, but I think that is very important on continue to do research on that.